So this, as I think some of the previous speakers have noted, this is a very interesting format. It's actually quite different from anything I've done before in a talk. And it really involves going back into the archive and digging around for these things that you've long since forgotten. So at a personal level, that's really been quite fascinating. So we're going to be traveling back in time, but before we do that, I'll just give you a quick timeline of SpringSource, which was the company that I co-founded in 2004, so that you get a sense of how this fits into the big picture. So in late 2002, I published a book on Java development, which went by the snappy title of Expert One-on-One J2EE Development, Design and Development. This actually technically is the second book that is there on the slide. This book included quite a bit of code that I'd advanced as superior ways to implement some common architectural patterns. That code got a really positive reaction from readers of the book, and as a result, I decided to set up an open source project. So in early 2003, I set up an open source project that rapidly attracted some talented developers and became startlingly popular. So, by sometime in 2004, by the time we decided to found our company, we'd had something like 1 million downloads. So we realized that this was not only having a really big influence on how people wrote enterprise Java applications, it clearly had an economic potential, because if you've got, hundreds of thousands or more engineers working with your software, even if it's open source and free, that potentially is an interesting market. So the Spring framework, for those of you who are not familiar with the Java ecosystem, is an enterprise Java application framework. It provided a superior alternative to EJB and a lot of the very cumbersome J2EE standards advanced by Sun. It was open source, published under a very liberal license, the Apache software license, and as I mentioned, it resulted in an enormous community. So in mid-2004, some of the other key engineers who were working on the Spring codebase and myself decided that there was an opportunity here. We wanted to found our own business. We all kind of liked the idea of being independent, and we thought, something's happening here that's potentially exciting. The community continued to grow, and by the end of 2005, we established our first conference. And about 2.5 years after founding the company, we decided to seek venture funding. We'd been bootstrapped to this point, so I've kind of seen both the life of a bootstrapped entrepreneur and the life of a funded entrepreneur, and they're both very interesting things. From that point, the trajectory of the business really accelerated. We did a number of acquisitions. We raised $17 million in Series B in 2008. And we eventually were acquired by VMware for $420 million in September of 2009. So that hopefully gives you a bit of a sense of what the whole story was about. Enterprise Java infrastructure software with the aim of selling to folks deploying and building enterprise Java applications. So I'm going to talk about a very short part of this story. It's actually, I now realize, at the time that Danny was profiting from North Korean nuclear tests. And one interesting thing I was thinking as Danny told that story is, I barely even remember that. I barely even remember that because I was so damn busy with the company that, a little trivial thing like a rogue state detonating a nuclear weapon was kind of, not really very noticeable. So what was going on during this period, and why did we think this would be interesting to talk about today? So, to go back to 2006, so, late 2006, North Korea is playing with nukes. The head office of Interface 21, as our company was then called, is in John Humphrey's house in Greenwich in London. Now, although it doesn't look too bad from the front, as you can see, the back of the building is a little bit mangy. And this is the whole building. This is the office. It's literally that one room And another thing that you will note is that some of the other windows in the building open. This one doesn't. You normally don't think about suffering in terms of the summer in England, but the summer of 2006 was actually quite hot. I believe there was the hottest day ever in southern England. It was about 39 degrees. And I could not use the office for quite some days that summer because it was just unbearable to be in there. So, we were clearly in a pretty rudimentary environment. And why was that? Well, that was because our business wasn't doing very well. Our business at this point was essentially a services business. We were selling consulting and training, and we'd sold a lot of it. We'd already trained about 3,000 developers. This is actual slideware from, I think, early 2007, using our then logo. As you can see, it was just predominantly Spring-related, but also fairly generic enterprise Java training. This was not ultimately what we wanted to be doing. We realized that services businesses aren't really the right way to build a lot of value in a company, but it was the only thing that we could successfully bootstrap. And you know what? Things were not going very well. This period is interesting because it was a period where we had a complete transformation in the business. So late 2006, I'm sitting in that quite grungy office. We're running a training and consulting business. We are quite literally living from hand to mouth. So I and two of my co-founders were not paid for months at a time. We had some employees and we never missed a single paycheck for them, but life was really pretty tough for founders with mortgages. We were trying to build a more strategic line of business, which we thought would be support for the software. So in other words, instead of merely selling services, getting enterprises to pay us for support, 24/7 support on the mission-critical apps they were building on the framework. But there were a couple of problems. We couldn't really launch that because we didn't have enough money to scale up a sales team. And we were struggling in our core product. So the Spring framework by this point was well over 1 million lines of code. It was pretty complex code. And we were trying to deliver Spring 2.0 and we were late. We were really struggling even to develop the open source code, let alone to develop any value adds that would make us more money. By late 2007, things were very different. We had raised $10 million from Benchmark, who are one of the premier investors in Silicon Valley. We had a Bay Area-based executive team. I remained CEO but moved to the Valley. And we now had dedicated product engineering resource. So we were finally able to deliver on our product plans. So what I'd like to talk through is, how that experience unfolded, what was difficult, what we got wrong, what we got right, and what we learnt from it. So the core challenge was to transform from a services business to a product business. It's important to think about where we came from. So these are the four co-founders, myself, Jürgen Hurler, who still writes the bulk of the code on Spring today, Colin Sampliano, and Keith Donald. So as you can see, there is some diversity in this group of founders. It's predominantly expressed in that 50% of them have got hair and 50% of them have not got hair. However, there was really no other diversity. We were all fundamentally techies, and none of us really had the experience of building the kind of business that we needed to build. The only one who had any relevant experience of the software business was Colin, and in retrospect, I think Colin was much righter than the rest of us about various things at that point. But unfortunately, we partly didn't listen, and also I think Colin was closer to being right, but he didn't have the experience either to drive what we needed to do. So at this point, we didn't really know what we wanted to do, and that was part of the problem. Originally, our aim was to build a consulting and training business. That was probably the first year. we rapidly realized that there was a much, much bigger opportunity than this. I mean, consulting and training businesses, any services business, is not tremendously valuable. If you look at revenue multiples, they're typically somewhere around 1. In fact, I think when EDS were sold a few years ago, it was 0.7 was the revenue multiple. So we'd realised that this wasn't going to work. And of course, the reason these businesses are not valuable is because they can't really fund IP creation. The margin is so low that you can't fund serious product development. There is a reason. For example, at Accenture or IBM Global Services don't develop a lot of IP. We'd fondly imagined that as we had more and more people coming in, we were selling more training, our price point was really high and we had no problem billing people out for $2,500 a day, we imagined that that would naturally give us a dividend of the ability to fund software development. And it really didn't. It didn't give us nearly enough. We were immensely ambitious for Spring. So one of the key things that we did right was we wanted to make Spring dominant in enterprise Java, and we did. We did it with a absolutely single-minded and passionate zeal, and that made everything else possible. But while we were absolutely obsessed with Spring dominating enterprise Java, we were much less ambitious, at least at this point, for the company. So, one key lesson right here is you need diversity in your group of founders. We should have realized much sooner than we did that we needed not to be a group of people who are pretty similar. We needed to have people in that group who were quite dissimilar. So in late 2006, we reached a key turning point. It was a very, very difficult time, and we realized that it's just not happening. We'd frankly stalled. We were trying to deliver a major overhaul of our open source software with Spring 2.0. It was late. There were more bugs than we would like in it. We just didn't have the resource to do this and keep the lights on. And it was abundantly clear that the best we could do was tread water. We weren't going to be swimming anywhere. So we made a number of decisions that really changed things. We made our first senior hire of someone who was completely different from the founding team. And this was Neelan Choksi, who was became our COO. Now, the interesting thing here is, well, amongst other things, if you look at the guy's teeth, perfect teeth, this guy is obviously American. He also was an experienced entrepreneur. He had successfully done one previous startup that he'd sold to one of the large software companies in our space. He'd been involved in another startup before that wasn't successful. But, he had both an MBA and a lot of relevant experience. So we also decided to overhaul our business plan. We'd previously had a business plan, but it was incredibly fuzzy. And Neelan and I sat down and spent a lot of time thinking about it and wrote a business plan that actually proved to work rather well. And we realized that we needed to raise funding. So one of the interesting things that happened at this point is we started to specialize. Prior to that, everybody had done everything. So for example, if you look at this group of guys, so this one, what's this one doing? This one is delivering training courses, doing probably most of our sales and writing a little bit of software. This one's writing software. He is delivering training and doing all our selling in North America. He's delivering training and doing evangelism, predominantly in North America. And everybody did a bit of everything. So, for example, Keith also handled all the banking because he was the only one who had a US address. Colin handled all the infrastructure, so our mail server and Jira and all that kind of stuff. So, everybody did a bit of everything. There was no real specialization. So, at the same time as Neelan came in, we gradually started to specialize more in terms of what the original founders were really good at. And probably the biggest change was my role. And this was possibly not so much what I was really good at this time, but what I really, really needed to do. I actually did a lot of soul searching as to whether I was the right CEO. and I was quite seriously willing to step down. And instead, I figured that, I just needed to approach this completely differently. I needed to stop pretending that I could write code anymore, and I really needed to focus on the business. So, I completely changed the way I approached it, and, I guess to my way of thinking at that time, I went over to the dark side. I actually discovered I really liked it on the dark side, and I'm still living there very, very happily. But, I think at some point as a technical founder, you need to either change or become CTO. It's as simple as that. I think any thought that you can be a technical founder in a rapidly growing company and still write large amounts of code is delusional. If that's what you want to do, you really need to have someone else running the business. Round about this time, something interesting came in, which was an acquisition offer from an extremely large player in our industry. So this was an offer for $25 million with up to another $25 million on earnout and retention. We'd taken not a cent of funding at this point, so it's actually not too bad. At this point, there's probably about 6 people with significant equity in the business. Not a horrible offer. I think if we ultimately hadn't done better, I do think that my mother-in-law would have brought this up constantly. I made the terrible mistake of actually telling her about this, and she wouldn't speak to me for 2 days because we declined it. But this actually was really significant in 2 ways. One was it made us think about what we want to do. So we got all our shareholders on the phone. It went for 4 hours, the conversation, and at the end of it, we were all, absolutely fired up that, look, yeah, this is nothing compared to what we can be worth. So it played a really important role. Okay, so how did this transformation take place? Well, what was hard? Cultural change is very, very hard. It sounds like one of those soft and fuzzy things that should be a lot easier than something tangible like code. It's actually not. So there were a number of axes here which had to change. One was changing from consulting to product. That was ridiculously difficult from a cultural perspective. Our employees absolutely loved their engagements with customers. Customers absolutely loved them. So you'd get these, staff who would say, look, you can bill me out at £1,900 a day. How can you possibly not want to do this? And, that actually was probably one of the hardest things. That we had salespeople who wanted to sell consulting, we had services staff who wanted to do consulting, and suddenly, we don't want to emphasize that anymore. That process took about 2 years, and it was really quite painful. Second was we'd previously been a wholly distributed company, and now we introduced some office hubs. When you're completely distributed and you function fine, and you suddenly put in co-located office teams, it really doesn't work very well. It's very difficult. Finally, we changed from being a predominantly European company to being a predominantly American company. I decided to do this very explicitly and say, look guys, we are now a US-based company. We're going to do things the US way. I believe it was the right decision, but it was somewhat painful. In some ways, it was better because we had much nicer office space. This was our office in San Mateo, where there was a lovely little pond outside my window, and also I had an office that was large enough to have a treadmill and a conference table just in my own office. But at times it was difficult. There was a degree of culture clash. This is an exhibit that you will not find anywhere online. This is our brief-lived campaign from late 2007 for weapons for the war on Java complexity. This campaign was instigated by our US and very American then VP of marketing. And so he had our products represented as tanks and warships and fighter jets. Look, I thought this was all good fun because, after all, the warships do kind of look like bath toys. So I didn't see any great harm in this. But believe me, it caused some problems. I had a deputation from SpringSource Germany saying, look, we can't talk about this. We do not talk about war. And of course they were right. I mean, it was just not an appropriate thing to do, particularly with the European team that we had in place. And I mean, even those kind of little things can be quite important. Like one, although I got it wrong with this, one that I did get right is I very quickly sent a memo around to the Bay Area office saying, guys, please do not refer to SpringSource even internally as SS, because this does not go down well in Europe. Strangely, while SS, even in Britain, is obviously, perceived, immediately as something sinister, Americans just don't, SS doesn't figure very highly in their consciousness. So, a lot of these things that sound relatively trivial can actually be painful. So that stuff was hard, but what do we make hard for ourselves? What do we stuff up? I actually should have said fucked up, because I've heard fuck so many times today that I shouldn't have bottled it. I should have actually put the F word on the slide. So we made a dog's breakfast of product management. Why did we do that? Because we didn't hire product managers, which is kind of obvious, but it's a classic problem that I've seen in engineering-led startups. We were totally awesome in Spring product management, and I mean, I'm quite serious about that. We caused Spring to grow like crazy. We were immensely successful against our competitors. We really nailed that. But product management for commercial offerings is different, and we didn't know how to do it. And that really meant that we were influenced by what we wanted to build rather than what our customers wanted to buy. Very often when people fuck things up in businesses, they are things that are unbelievably obvious. I mean, that is so obvious that, you'd think, how can, reasonably intelligent people not realize this, that you build what people want to buy? Sadly, this is a mistake that is not unique to the history of SpringSource, and it's very, very common that engineers fall in love with what they want to build. We also found that open source support was a hard sell. By this time, we were now emphasizing our support subscription rather than training and consulting, and selling support on open source is really, really hard. However, we got a number of things right, which is why I'm here today. One was mission. Even when we weren't building the right thing, and even when we weren't selling the right thing, we had the same mission. And that mission was simplifying enterprise Java, and that mission did not change throughout the life of the product, life of the company. Very, very important. If there's something that unifies your team and unifies you with your customers and advocates and champions, you can afford to get some other things wrong if you get that right. So we had this clarity of mission and purpose. I think we got culture right. Culture really results from example. Writing things down is useful, but by far the most important thing is the example of the founders, which scales out to rank and file employees. For example, if you look at the culture of, say, Oracle, the culture of Oracle is Larry Ellison writ large, even though Oracle employs tens of thousands of people. So how the founders behave really sets a model for how the culture will unfold. And I think we did a pretty good job of that. Code quality. That was predominantly thanks to Jürgen. Our code quality was exceptional. That in turn meant that our community loved us. It meant that we could hire really good people because they thought it was an honor to work with people like Jürgen. And of course, the size of the community and the nice things that people said about us made it easier to raise funding. So a lot of these things were, really built on each other. So what happened after this period? Well, as by this point, of course, I've long since gone over to the dark side, so, I speak fluent American business speak. So I'll express it using both weapons and American business cliches. At this point, we were winning the air war. So the air war in VC speak is kind of marketing and adoption, whereas the ground war is like sales and, grinding out individual wins. So we were really very successful in the air war, even if we weren't always faring so well in the ground war. That, in turn, meant that we had a long runway. We had a long runway because we were prudent in managing burn and because we were able to raise funding at a high valuation. Adoption is incredibly important in valuation. Adoption is generally more important than numbers. So this is something that I think a lot of Australian businesses get wrong because a lot of Australian investors get it wrong, and they really worry too much about revenue and profitability too early rather than get adoption. So this enabled us to get a professional product manager and to realize what we'd got wrong in our commercial product. It enabled us to develop proprietary IP, so we weren't just doing an evangelical sale around open source. And it meant that we could even use our high valuation to make a number of acquisitions, to expand our product portfolio and have more things to sell. And that worked remarkably well. So, at this point, what we were selling to customers was much more complete. It was now not merely around development, it was also around deployment, where we found it was much easier to get people to write checks. So, we had a much richer offering and it was really aligned with what customers wanted. We were able to grow the field aggressively. Once we'd figured out what we wanted to sell, we could actually build a large sales team to sell it. So by the time we sold the company, we were around a $30 million run rate and we're close to 100% year-on-year growth. And that is the reason that VMware were willing to pay $420 million for the company. Interestingly, despite coming from that grungy office and fucking up various things along the way, we had learnt well. By the time of the acquisition, our systems and processes were clearly superior to VMware. So, what the sales reps used, what we used to manage our source code, you name it, our processes were generally superior. So, we'd learned a lot on the way. So, what are some of the key lessons? Have a clear mission and plan because everything else depends on it. And when you have a clear message, you operate as a team. People know why they're doing what they're doing, and that is incredibly important. Build what your customers want, not what you want to build. Product management is distinct from engineering, and it's very important that you understand that. You can make a lot of mistakes so long as you learn from them, but obviously you need to be prudent about runway. You should educate yourself on what lies ahead. If you look at the mistakes that we made, and particularly the mistakes that I personally made, I didn't seek mentors nearly as early as I should have done. I didn't know what I was doing. When you don't know what you are doing, you really should go find people who know what you need to do. And I didn't do that early enough. Today it's really easy because not only are mentors valuable, but there is such amazing resources out there that just weren't available back then. As a founding team and a founder, you need to understand your strengths and weaknesses. And where you're weak, hire someone who is strong and treat them with respect, even though they may not be founders. Seriously ask the question, if you're a technologist, are you the right CEO? You may want to grow into the right CEO, but in that case, you probably need to stop writing code. And the answer may be that you're not the right CEO, and a lot of harm can be done to a company by someone remaining as CEO when they shouldn't be. And as I've mentioned several times, what I think is the most important point that I've made today, which is recruit a diverse team. Diversity is really good. Diversity is obviously good in the sense that it's normally used, around ideally you would like people from different backgrounds, people with different genders, but it's incredibly important to make the company smarter. A company collectively knows the sum of everything known by its employees. And unless you start hiring people that are different, you get a lot of people who know the same stuff. Okay, I think I went way over time, so I think I'll stop here. I will leave you, however, with a bonus photo, which is on runways. This is the most amazing runway I've ever seen. I've actually landed there. That's in Nepal. It's Lukla. And the plane kind of has to lose speed quite rapidly.
Thank you. I wanted to dig down deeper into that transition when you moved to the US and you made that decision that you'd like to give it a shot to become a great CEO. What are the most important aspects of that journey? And then how did you know that A, you wanted to do it, and then B, that you were pretty good at?
I'm a pretty ambitious kind of guy, so I guess my ambitions generally increase compared to where I am at any point. So, you know, previously I'd been immensely ambitious about Spring. At this point, I started to become very, very ambitious for the company and think, look, we're not just a services business. I mean, look at, you know, IBM WebSphere. It's a dreadful product. It's doing $1.5 billion. You know, come on. We can not only make a lot of money here, but we can free customers from some really terrible technology.
Hey, actually, to talk more about that concept of ambition, because, you know, to me, people don't start at day zero and say they're going to be a billion-dollar company. It's this journey of discovering how passionate the community was around Spring and all these moments along the way where your ambition sort of ratchets up or step changes up. Talk about how the ambition grew both within you, but then maybe you mentioned that tension within the team where maybe some other team members, their ambition wasn't growing as fast as your ambition, and how do you resolve that?
Yeah, I mean, there was some degree of tension, but I mean, on the whole, I would say that we were a very cohesive group of founders. One of the reasons for that is we went through a true test of fire together. So even before this period I mentioned, we bootstrapped the company by doing a fixed price contract for a large financial institution in the UK. I personally worked 7 days a week, 17 hours a day for 5 weeks straight. It's actually very difficult to work 17 hours a day. And you know, 2 of my co-founders did likewise. And you know, that left a really deep trace in that, you know, we just knew that we could really count on each other when the chips were down. And you know, I think to some degree I did kind of push and prod a bit because probably my ambition generally was bigger. But you know, I think that people believe passionately in the technology, and yeah, I think they were very willing to go there.
What was the insight or the fuel that led you to be able to say no to that initial acquisition offer? I think, you know, you're very modest in describing a business that wasn't working, in your words, with the training and the consulting and so on, but clearly the acquisition offer, the ability to raise $10 million, what was that fuel behind it? Like, what did you pay attention to that you knew it would be successful, if not currently?
Well, I think that I just felt a profound conviction. So actually, years later, after the exit, I was talking to my wife, and she said, "How did you know that you were going to be successful?" And I said, "Look, I just knew." And she said, "I didn't realize I was married to a nut." It's like I really just
was it
felt
the passion in which the customers use it? Was it like the comprehensiveness of just changing their whole programming lives over to Spring? Was it any of those things, or was it this world of software was so broken that you knew it would be fixed by someone?
So I think, you know, we had an absolute belief in the rightness of our technical solution. So we were convinced that, you know, the average customer was living in hell, and we could possibly not put them in heaven, but at least move them, you know, to purgatory.
Yep. 2 floors up.
No, we could do rather better than that, actually. But so, you know, I think that the reason we felt so confident is really with businesses, you've got a certain amount of raw materials to work with. We knew our raw materials were incredible. I mean, there are not many developer communities out there that are over 1 million. This was over 1 million people building software of high business criticality, which was very important to the companies they work for. So, you know, I think we always realized that the problem was about execution. We needed to figure out how to take this raw material and make it build a profitable business. And we had an utter conviction that it felt on execution. I mean, this was one of the things that I used to say. I'd be quite honest about the challenges we were facing. And I would say to all employees, look, this is about execution. If we fail, it's our fault because there is success to be had here. We just haven't quite gotten there yet. And I mean, I think there's actually an interesting question here. So doing not so well, how did you get the valuation to 10 million? Well, firstly, we'd cleaned up a lot of the problems so that, at least we'd used the few months lead up to our Series A quite well. So at least we were able to show a nice revenue growth. But the biggest thing was adoption. I mean, it's particularly Bay Area investors are willing to think much more about adoption than financials.
Talk about sort of that process of raising capital in Silicon Valley, and then talk about some of the good things, but also some of the bad things that came with raising a large amount of capital and putting yourself on some track. What were the sort of pros and cons after you took the money?
Look, I mean, I've been involved as a board member in 5 other companies since, so I've seen a range of things. I have to say, quite honestly, for SpringSource, there was nothing bad whatsoever about it. Cool. Partly because our valuation was high enough that the investors never controlled the company, at least from a shareholding position. And secondly, because my investors were awesome. I mean, the lead of Series A was Peter Fenton at Benchmark, who is one of the top investors in the world. The lead of Series B was Kevin Afrizi at Excel, who is one of the top investors in the world. And I mean, they were fantastic partners. They were really ethical. They provided a lot of really useful advice. They really gave me a lot of personal mentoring in terms of making that transition. I know this sounds, it sounds like I'm sucking up, but it's completely true. So, I think if you have a partnership with a great investor, it can really help you a lot. I mean, I have seen situations where companies have bad investors and it can be ugly. So, it's not just about the valuation. It really is about a partnership because guess what? You're never going to get rid of an investor once they're in your company.
Yep.
I mean, there's one situation that I've been in where I've been occasionally complaining to my wife about the behavior of a particular investor. And she'll say, well, can't you get rid of him? No. The CEO can go. Other board members might go, but this guy is not ever going to go.
It's actually the only irreversible decision you will make as a company. I think in many ways, you blaze this trail of how to build a great open source company or a company based upon this open source community, and talk a little bit about some of those board roles that you have now, and then explain what are the mistakes over and over that companies make in building a company based upon an open source project, and what are the things that work really, really well?
Well, I think that some of the mistakes that people make are made where the open source there isn't a distinction between open source and the commercial activities of the company. So I am a very firm believer that you need to have proprietary IP. I think strangely it works out best for the open source community as well. I think if you try to be, a pure play open source model, the economics simply don't work, and that ends up being quite bad for the open source project or projects themselves. So I think you really need to have a clean split between open source and proprietary IP. And I think you need to be absolutely transparent with the community about the rationale for that. It shouldn't ever be ad hoc. It shouldn't be, well, this is open source and this feature is commercial and this feature is commercial. It should be, these are the things that we build in open source. These are the things that are commercial. And the things that are commercially oriented should be oriented towards typically the enterprise market.
And go a little bit deeper on that, like in terms of how to segment, like what is the product, like going over to the, what enterprises are willing to pay for, what's an easy thing for them to say yes to.
Generally, anything in the security space is reasonably good. It's also pretty attractive to offer things that are around deployment. Anything with an operational focus is likely to be attractive to an enterprise. I mean, one of the first things about open source business is that the majority of the people who use the software are never going to pay you a cent. And you kind of have to get to love it. It kind of seems paradoxical, but you have to get to the point where you feel good about the fact that 99% of the people who use your software are never going to pay you. And the reason that you should feel good about it is because you need to love those people. You want them to be your champion. So, for example, we saw this time and time again. Somebody works for a little company that was never going to buy anything from us, but they love our open source software. Then they go to work for Morgan Stanley, and they become an advocate of getting us as a software partner. So, I think it's really important to nurture the community and accept the fact that most people will not pay you, and help them become more successful.
Sure. All right, we'll go to the questions on the Slido. So many popular languages suffer from the fact that they were born before we knew what makes a great language. What do you think of this is the future of Java?
Well, there's a couple of questions in that. I don't think we'll ever know what makes a great language. I mean, I think that with every language that comes up, because languages have a very long lifespan, we start to learn the imperfections of any language even before it becomes terribly popular. So I don't think there's ever going to be perfection. And I think there's obviously different paradigms which all have their strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, functional, object-oriented, or, simple imperative style programming in something like C or assembler all have their place, and it's always a trade-off. Future of Java, I think that Java should evolve slowly. I don't have any problem with the fact that it evolves slowly. I think that other things like Scala on the JVM can really take up the slack of rapid innovation on the JVM, and I think that's great. I don't think Java should try to be what it's not.
Who do you look up to in the tech industry?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I admire people who've done something, novel, or something that few people have done. So, for example, I think the Atlassian guys have done an astonishing job because, they've really forged their own path. They've been crystal clear about how they were going to do it, and they've executed it. So I have tremendous respect for that. I mean, I guess I also would say Mark Benioff in terms of, just creating a new category and just bringing something out of nothing.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, on a personal level, Paul Maritz, who was one of the top executives at Microsoft and was CEO of VMware and my boss for a couple of years. I think Paul's an incredibly nice man. I think he's super smart, and I also admire the fact that he's really done a lot of good in the non-profit sector, particularly in developing countries beyond his technology work.
Oh, might have one more question. How do you define success and what?
Okay, can I take the second question as well?
Yeah,
I can answer it really quickly.
Okay.
How can you minimize the impact on morale when removing dud hires? This is one of the most surprising things I learnt as a manager and have seen consistently. You don't hurt morale when you take out a dud hire, you improve morale. It seems really strange, but if you have someone who's not pulling their weight and you take them out, the rest of the team feel better because they feel that, wow, you get it. You know that, quality. Yeah. So, I believe that you should certainly give people a opportunity to improve their performance. But if someone really isn't pulling their weight and they're really not working out, the best thing to do is to let them go. Okay, the other question is absolutely fascinating. How do you define success? Well, I'm going to answer it somewhat narrowly in terms of the things that I feel great personal satisfaction about with SpringSource. And, look, I'm not going to say that I don't care about the money, because that would be lying. But it's not number one in terms of the things that make me feel good. One of the things that makes me feel good is that I assembled and led a team of really, really talented people. And, that was a privilege. So, for example, I mean, I'm a pretty good programmer. And I probably, if I'd still been writing code, wouldn't have been in the top 10, probably not even close to the top 10 by the time we sold the company. And that was really quite astonishing to have assembled a team including people who were happy to work for me but were actually better than me. And the other thing that I think I personally, when I think about what success I've had, something that I really am proud of is I think I looked after my co-founders and I looked after my team very, very well. And yeah, that makes me happy. To me, success is not just doing well as an individual. Success, is hopefully creating something of value that benefits users and customers, but also, behaving in a way towards your team so that, success is not just enjoyed by the founders or the CEO.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank Rod Johnson.